on Wall Street. Tom Busby, Bloomberg Radio. This is Bloomberg Law with June Grosso from Bloomberg Radio.
The Supreme Court's conservative justices appeared skeptical of a Hawaii law prohibiting the carrying of a gun in private places that are open to the public unless the property owner gives explicit permission. Lengthy arguments on Tuesday touched on topics from Hawaii's pre-statehood treatment of gun rights to 19th century laws aimed at disarming formerly enslaved people. Joining me is Haley Lawrence, Executive Director of the Duke Center for Firearms Law. Haley, start by telling us about this Hawaii law.
So back in 2023, the Hawaii legislature enacted a law that effectively prohibits one from carrying a firearm onto private property without the express permission of the property owner or agent of the property owner. So in the case of an apartment, someone who leases the apartment. This flips the default setting of what we normally think of and what most states do. And so Hawaii, instead of saying you have a right unless the property owner tells you otherwise, has said by default, you have no right to bring a firearm onto private property, even private property held open to the public, unless you have the express consent from the property owner.
Chief Justice Roberts said, people don't have to obtain the permission of private property owners before going door to door to canvass for a political candidate. And he questioned why gun rights are being treated differently than free speech rights. I mean, it seems pretty obvious why.
Yeah, so in Hawaii's brief, they kind of analogize between the rights of the First Amendment gives and the rights of the Second Amendment gives. The challenge of that is that the court has fundamentally different tests to evaluate when a First Amendment right has been infringed and the Second Amendment right has been infringed. And by that I mean, in the First Amendment context, the court focuses a lot on interest balancing and weighing various burdens of a law for government action based on someone's right to expression and life. In the Second Amendment context, the seminal case we got a few years ago in 2022 was Bruin, which expressly foreclosed the use of interest balancing in Second Amendment cases. Instead, it's focused on history and tradition. Does the modern law that's being challenged have sufficient basis in the nation's history and tradition and the nation's textbooks for a reason to hold history and tradition such that it is constitutional? The reason we put emphasis on nation is because I'm sure Hawaii, for example, is not in principle deeply rooted in Hawaiian legal tradition. Court is particularly interested in that, and petitioners push back on it, which is interesting for a number of reasons, particularly because Hawaii was a state until the late 20th century, and so it's in a period of time where the arguments that we're focusing on as relevant in terms of what the history and tradition of the nation, Hawaiian law has never been relevant to that inquiry.
Is that the reason why the San Francisco appellate court upheld this law and the New Jersey appellate court struck down a similar law?
No, so actually the reason why the Ninth Circuit ruled in Hawaii's favor is because of several extra Hawaii historical analogs that the state pointed to. There are several laws from New Jersey and other states in the Northeast that existed at the founding, and then again at the Reconstruction era. So it pointed to several laws over a course of 100 years from states outside of Hawaii to support the proposition that the government can regulate private property and vindicate the rights of property owners, but also do so in the gun context.
What was Hawaii's best argument in defending its law?
So the challenge for Hawaii is that I think they came into, of course, I was largely skeptical of its arguments to begin with. The Justice Jackson is an incisive questioner as ever, and I think did her best to, particularly after the divergence about First Amendment case law, bring us back to first principles of Bruin. The thing I was looking for when I was listening to these arguments yesterday is whether or not the court is thinking about this as a property rights case or a Second Amendment public carry case. It seems like the conservative justices in particular were focused on this and the finding of it as a public carry case. And the reason I say that is because so much of it talked about the imposition that the law placed on someone's right to carry a firearm into kind of places held open to the public. A frequent example that was used in oral arguments was a gas station, and other sort of retail establishments that hold themselves open to the public. One thing that I think was interestingly absent is sort of like the temporal location on on private property held open to the public, and the role that those temporal locations would play in this analysis. By that I mean, just because a station is open for certain hours of the day, it may or may not welcome someone public carrying onto the property. That doesn't mean someone has a right to go onto the property when the business is closed with a firearm, right? And so I was interested by the absence of that discussion in the oral argument.
So Justice Alito talked about the state was relegating the Second Amendment to second-class status, and that seems to be a concern that they have been talking about, the conservatives, at least Justice Alito and Justice Thomas, for so long. I mean, is that fair assessment?
They've certainly been parroting that line for quite some time. I think it came up in particularly obvious fashion in the First Amendment, Second Amendment discussion. But the fundamental difference is my speech isn't going to kill someone. My speech doesn't present a significant public safety risk, and the speech that does is regulated. Shouting fire in front of theater is the obvious example that people come back to. And so in my research and my personal capacity, I don't think that the Second Amendment is favored, right? Like they've said, but that's the court's position, and it seems like it will guide the rest of this term and its future Second Amendment case law for the foreseeable future.
Explain how the Bruin case, which established that history and tradition analysis, how it's been confusing for the lower courts and has led to lots of litigation over just what the test is.
Yeah, so the test is, the first question, is the challenge regulation, does it invoke the plain meaning of the Second Amendment? If the answer is yes, then the government bears the burden of showing that the challenge law finds sufficient support in the history and tradition of the nation's firearms law regulation. There are a lot of open questions about what constitutes an arm. For example, there are several cert petitions before the Supreme Court this term about large capacity magazines and whether or not that falls within the first step of Bruin or the second step of Bruin. There are questions about who is covered. The court actually on Tuesday denied several cert petitions in cases arguing that folks who have been convicted of a nonviolent felony should have their firearms rights restored and fall within the people covered by the Second Amendment. That's the who question. There's also the levels of generality question, which comes up in the second step of the Bruin inquiry, which is, okay, so let's say we have a bunch of examples from various periods in history of laws that regulate firearms ownership, firearms carrying, what types of firearms you can have, etc. The question is, the Bruin posited basically the what, the why, and the how. So what's being regulated, why is it being regulated, and how is it being regulated? And so the levels of generality question is challenging. One. Two, lower courts are struggling to identify the relevant level of generality to answer the principles question, like why are things being regulated, who is the subject of the regulation, what's the purpose of the regulation? Because in Rahimi, we've got a pretty broad statement of the why and who, which is that the government is allowed, in simple terms, to disarm people that they find dangerous. That involves a challenge to laws prohibiting folks subject to domestic violence restraining orders from possessing firearms. And so that's a pretty high level of generality. If we're talking about dangerous people writ large, then that's a pretty high level of generality. But in this case, the questions from the justices, the arguments themselves were, particularly about the historical analogs, were much more narrowly focused about, well, this law was about poaching. The historical law that you're talking about is about poaching, but this isn't about poaching. It's about regulating private property and allowing someone onto your private property with a firearm. If you take them in a really broad view, they're both about regulating private property and the right to carry a firearm onto the private property. But if you take it in a much narrower view, it's going to be a lot harder to find support for modern laws in historical analogs, because many of the problems that modern firearms laws confront simply didn't exist 100 or 200 years ago.
So there have been some cases, you mentioned Rahimi, where they ruled against the expansion of gun rights. Is there a line that you see them, drawing as to when and where they'll allow gun restrictions and where they won't? Or is it just case by case?
It's a hard question to answer, and I think it's the reason so many lower courts have been struggling to find a through line, which is that we have all of these open questions about the document because it is so big. So I, much like them, can't give you a straight answer one way or the other, unfortunately.
If they strike down the Hawaii law, property owners can still put up signs that say, you can't come into my store or my gas station carrying a gun.
That's exactly right. Yep. So property owners in Hawaii will still have the right to exclude. That's a fundamental right in property law across the nation, and that applies even to private property holders and public.
There are a couple of other states, 4 other states that have similar restrictions. This decision automatically invalidate those laws, or will those have to be challenged in court as well?
As far as my understanding is, this is a facial challenge, so it would only apply as to Hawaii. California would be similar, but a little bit more stringent, was also challenged, although they did not bring a cert petition with respect to the California law because petitioners won below at the Ninth Circuit on the California law. So I don't think there's anything further to do on that front. But as far as the other states go, I would expect challenges, at least in the federal district court, applying principles of what we get in Pittsburgh to those other laws. But one of the other open questions I neglected to mention before is what laws are appropriate for analogy. And so a lot of the frankly more observant exchanges yesterday before the court were about Reconstruction era laws that aimed to disarm people of color and newly freed slaves. Justice Jackson thinks that including them in history and tradition is sort of a natural, logical result of Bruin test, which is it exists as part of the tradition. Repugnant as it be, it's still part of the tradition. And, I think it's particularly impactful, meaningful, coming from her who so regularly fights these sort of battles. And I think it just evinces that she is continuing to push what she sees as the flaws in Bruin with little apparent success, I think, with some of her more conservative colleagues. But I think she's highlighting both for the public and for judges across the nation the methodological shortcomings of Bruin and the types of questions the court will still have to answer.
Thanks so much, Haley. That's Haley Lawrence, Executive Director of the Duke Center for Firearms Law. I'm June Grosso. Stay with us. Today's top stories and global business headlines are coming up right now.
From the financial capital of the world, 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Business app. This is WBBR New York, Bloomberg 1130. Coming up, the latest market moving headlines from Bloomberg. First, an update from our partners at CBS News. CBS News on the hour, your home for original reporting.
I'm Jennifer Kuiper. President Trump at the World Economic Forum in Switzerland backed off for his European tariff threat over Greenland and tells CNBC that along with NATO,
we have a concept of a deal. I think it's going to be a very good deal for the United States, also for them. And we're going to work together on something having to do with the Arctic role, but also Greenland, and it has to do with the security, great security, strong security, and other things.
NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte tells Fox News that he had not discussed the key issue of Danish sovereignty over Greenland in his meeting with President Trump. CBS's Linda Kenyon also reports the reported breakthrough followed Trump's address at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where he reiterated the U.S. will take Greenland, but he also said it would not do so by force. In announcing the framework of a deal, Trump also said he is canceling tariffs on the U.S. allies in Europe that balked at his plans for Greenland. The tariffs were set to begin on February 1st. A Republican-led House committee has voted to recommend that the full chamber hold former President Bill Clinton and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in contempt of Congress for refusing a subpoena in its Jeffrey Epstein probe. CBS's Allison Keyes. Committee Chair James Comer says,
the ayes have it,
and the committee adopts the report,
recommending that the House of Representatives find William J. Clinton in contempt of Congress.
Such charges have historically been used only as a last resort, and Comer initiated the proceedings after the Clintons refused a subpoena to appear for months. The Clintons say they didn't know about Epstein's abuse
has offered written declarations about their interactions with him. A major winter storm is expected to start impacting portions of the country on Friday. CBS News meteorologist Nikki Nolan.
We have a significant winter storm event that is shaping up in the southern U.S. and it's going to make its way across the eastern U.S. and impact parts of the mid-Atlantic and the Northeast come the start of next week. We have a lot of Arctic cold air that'll be moving in starting on Thursday, and it will really just sink in and stick around through the upcoming weekend and into the start of next week.
The Supreme Court has heard oral arguments over President Trump's efforts to oust Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook. The president announced his intention to fire Cook in late August over allegations that she committed mortgage fraud, the first time that a president has tried to remove a sitting Fed governor. Cook has denied those allegations. CBS's Jan Crawford was in court.
I think it was very clear that all the justices, liberals and conservatives, very skeptical of the president's broad arguments. I didn't see any takers.
This is CBS News.
Real crimes, real justice. Follow and listen to 48 Hours on the free Odyssey app or wherever you get your podcasts. Wesley Financial Group is no longer.
Ask yourself this question. Is it really worth holding on to that timeshare that you know you need to get rid of? Here's the truth. The average maintenance fee just went up over 17%. That could have been 117%, and there's nothing you can do about it. When you buy a timeshare, you give them a blank check for annual maintenance and assessment fees. I'm Chuck McDowell, founder of Wesley Financial Group. For 15 years, I've helped over 50,000 families cancel their timeshare. Not sell it, not transfer it, cancel it. Did you buy a timeshare because they told you it was a great investment and your maintenance fees would never go up? That's a lie. Are you ready to get rid of your timeshare once and for all? Simply call us and I'll send you our timeshare exit kit that explains all your options for cancellation.
Call Wesley now for your timeshare exit kit. 800-932-5858. That's 800-932-5858. 800-932-5858.
Tuna in cans that can leak and be tainted by bacteria has made it to the marketplace.
The U.S. Food and Drug Administration says canned tuna under the Genova Yellowfin tuna brand that was recalled nearly a year ago has been accidentally shipped to 6 different grocery store chains in 9 states. They include Meijer stores in Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin, Giant Foods in Maryland and Virginia, and Safeway, Albertsons, the Vons, and Pavilion stores in California. Jim Crisula, CBS News.
Ford is recalling roughly 119,000 vehicles due to a possible fire risk. Certain Ford Focus, Explorer, Escape, and MKC vehicles are being recalled because they have a defective engine block heater. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administrator says they may crack and even develop coolant leaks, causing them to short circuit. Then the block heaters are plugged in. Interim letters will go out in February 13th. Jennifer Kuiper, CBS News.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is the Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York, I'm Doug Krisner. Let's update top stories in action. We'll begin with President Trump, who will refrain from imposing tariffs on goods from those European nations opposed to.
Right about now.
This report is sponsored by Wellness Unmasked with Dr. Nicole Saphier. This week on Wellness Unmasked with Dr. Nicole Saphier, I will break down the new food pyramid and how you can use the updated guidelines to get healthier right now. Listen on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
In sports, Knicks and the Nets meet tonight at the Garden, and on the ice, the Islanders skate in Seattle tonight. Former Met Carlos Beltran, elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame.
Willing to associate with him even in the danger of their lives. Yeah, well, I mean, you could be right. You could be right. Obviously the words meant something, but it's
Relatively. Let's use that here. Relatively warm outside. It's 34 degrees right now. We're going to feel about 32 overnight. 53 humidity, so it's going to feel colder than that. Stuff up to 20 miles an hour tonight. You're listening to WNYC at 7:06. Support for NPR comes from the Skoll Foundation, dedicated to powering social innovators to transform the world. Learn more at skoll.org. It's All Things Considered from NPR News. I'm Scott Detrow in Washington.
And I'm Elsa Chang in Culver City, California. The Supreme Court today seemed likely to block President Trump to immediately remove Lisa Cook from the Federal Reserve Board. Both liberal and conservative justices had a pretty spirited argument lasting more than 2 hours. They expressed doubts about the president's claim of absolute power to fire members of the Fed board. NPR Legal Affairs correspondent Nina Totenberg reports. Trump announced on Truth Social last August that he was firing Cook from the Fed Board of Governors. In subsequent comments, he accused her of mortgage fraud prior to her appointment in 2022. Cook, an economist and the first black woman appointed to the board, has vehemently denied the charge through her lawyers. And the Supreme Court, which has allowed Trump to remove other agency heads, balked at the administration's emergency request to allow Trump to fire Cook. Today was the day of reckoning, and for the most part, things did not go well for the president. Solicitor General John Sauer opened this way.
Deceit or gross negligence by a financial regulator, financial transactions, is cause for removal.
That prompted this exchange with Chief Justice Roberts.
You begin by talking about deceit. Is what you said after that apply in the case of an inadvertent mistake contradicted by other documents and record? The president determined that this is at least gross negligence. Even if it was inadvertent mistake, it's a part of a mistake, so to speak. So it doesn't make a difference whether this was an inadvertent mistake or whether it was a devious way to get a better interest rate.
Justice Sotomayor noted that a Michigan bank had given Cook permission to rent her home there after she moved away. And Sotomayor recalled her own experience when she was appointed to the Supreme Court.
And frankly, I renovated my apartment the year before, thinking I would be in New York for the rest of my life. Things change.
Several justices observed that this is the first time since the Fed was established by Congress 112 years ago that any president has interfered with statutory independence of the Fed by firing one of its members. Justice Jackson had this question.
What is the evidence that has been presented and considered with respect to Ms. Cook's alleged misconduct?
General Sauer replied that the firing was justified in a letter to Cook, but he maintained that the president's decision on the matter is not subject to review, even by the Supreme Court, and that Cook was not entitled to
get my tickets now
before being removed. So, what would be required? Asked Justice Gorsuch.
Just a meeting across the conference table finished with you fired.
Justice Alito wondered whether the case should be sent back to the lower courts for fact-finding about the mortgage allegations. But Justice Kavanaugh was far more doubtful about the Trump administration's position.
But on that, your position that there's no judicial review, no process required, no remedy available, very low bar for cause that the president alone determines, and that would weaken, if not shatter, the independence of the Federal Reserve that we just discussed.
And Kavanaugh talked as well about what he called the real downstream effect if Trump were to prevail.
Big picture, what goes around comes around. All the current president's appointees President on January 20th, 2033. So what are we doing here? If we accept all these, no procedure, no judicial review, no remedy.
What's more, said Kavanaugh, a ruling for the president's me-only position would incentivize presidents to come up with trivial misdeeds or old and inconsequential allegations that are very difficult to disprove in order to get rid of Federal Reserve Board governors who are supposed to be independent and won't do the president's bidding. Making the counter-argument for Mr. Cook in court today was lawyer Paul Clement, who served as Solicitor General for President George W. Bush. He argued that the president alone cannot determine what is a legitimate cause to fire a member of the Fed.
If there's no judicial review, then this is all kind of a joke.
I understand your position, Justice Alito, but
How about if after the person assumes office, he supposedly the office holder is expressing deep admiration for Hitler or for the Klan?
replied Clement.
As an official, that would be be a peach in a heartbeat. And the fact that they would do peach in a heartbeat is going to cause them to resign in half a heartbeat. So, Estelito, is the minimum that the executives, in your view, had to provide. 3 elements said Clement: a hearing, notice in advance of the firing, and an opportunity to provide evidence to the decision makers. Sitting in the Supreme Court chair and listening to the arguments was Federal Reserve Board Chairman Jerome Powell, who very likely would be Trump's next target for removal should the president win this case. Nina Totenberg, NPR News, Washington.
For the last 2 weeks, federal immigration agents have been on the streets of Minneapolis. The Department of Homeland Security says there have been thousands of arrests, but they're getting criminals off the street. Some people in the city have told NPR it created a sense of terror. NPR's Jasmine Garth brings us the story of one 12-year-old girl who desperately needed to run one errand. Now it turned into a complex underground operation.
On the morning of January 17th, in southern Minneapolis, something very ordinary happened. A 12-year-old girl got her period for the first time. Everything that happened after that was out of the ordinary. So we're calling this girl in. Her first finished. Her family asked that it's because they are undocumented and their neighborhood has been the target of immigration raids. In fact, everyone in this story requested anonymity out of fear of retaliation from ICE. She woke up that morning. She noticed she had her period. Like many girls, she freaked out a little. But unlike many girls, she had been hiding in her house for the last few weeks. She hasn't even been going to school. She thought about going to get menstrual pads. She called her dad at work. He's a single father. He told her no. Do not go out into the streets, she told her. You have to stay inside. He himself isn't going outside unless a volunteer is driving him. He feels it makes him less likely to be stopped by ICE. He's absolutely right. A lot of immigrants are relying on their neighbors to drive them around the city. So her dad couldn't just rush back home. This launched a community effort involving a complex network of local volunteers. First, the dad called his pastor. The pastor called a church community leader, a woman. Her name is Lisette. She says, Eve's dad is scared. He said, ayúdame, por favor. He said to me, Lisette, help me, please. My daughter is bleeding a lot. I am alone in the house. Lisette reassured him, told him to stay calm. Si hubiera estado un tiempo normal, solamente le hubiera dicho, okay. However, she herself was too nervous. So Lisette called a neighbor, whose name is Aid. Here she is. Quiero pedirle un favor. Está asustada. Over the phone, Lisette told her, I need a favor. There's a girl. She's scared. She's crying. She doesn't know what to do. Abe paused. She wanted to help. Any other time, she said she would have gone out and done it. But since the killing of Renee Macklin Good by an ICE agent, she's been trying to stay inside. So she called her doctor. Enter Fanny. Fanny is a U.S. citizen, but she too worries about driving around and being really profiled. Even if you're not a citizen, just because I am Hispanic, they're still going to want to take me. Immigrants we spoke to in Minneapolis say they've been making this calculation for weeks, whether or not it's safe to go out. And often, they decide it's not. In response, there's been massive community mobilization. On a lot of street corners, you'll see neighbors standing guard. They're looking out for agents so they can alert their neighbors. We spoke to one watcher who asked to be called by her initials, JB. He's 69 years old. He was standing in a blustering wind. I don't care if it's 20 below. I don't care. We'll dress for it. We'll be here. This is way more important than a little chill air. Aid and Fanny say the street watchers make them feel safer. So they decided to do it, to drive to Eve's house with some packs. Bueno, cuando llegué le hablé que ella estaba ahí. Ya estaba por la parte de atrás. Aid says they parked in the back of the road. It felt too risky to park out front. He let them in through the back door. And that's how, several hours later, 5 people in a citywide network of volunteers got a 12-year-old girl her first menstrual pad. Here's Eve the next day talking to a nurse.
How are you feeling?
My tummy hurts, she told the nurse. This is an underground clinic for immigrants who are too scared to go to the doctor. The nurse comforted her.
It's normal. It's muy normal, okay? It can be like really scary when you get your period for the first time, but it's very normal.
He doesn't speak fluent English yet, but Lestat, the community leader who coordinated the whole operation, was there. She told her, this is going to happen to you once a month. Then she reminded her, you have an army of women behind you. She told Eve, we are made of a strong material. Even if we are drowning, we will find a way to stay afloat and get to the shore. Jonathan Garth, NPR News, Minneapolis.
Considered on WNYC, I'm Sean Carlson. The school's chancellor is one of the highest profile appointments to any new administration. It interests almost 1 million New York City public school kids and their parents and families. So joining us now is the newest city schools chancellor, Mark Samuels, to talk about what's on his agenda and how his first few weeks have been. Hey, Chancellor, welcome to All Things Considered.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So New York City schools are notorious for racial and economic segregation, right? And you've mentioned integration as a key part of an equity agenda for the city's public schools. What concrete steps can you take to advance integration in the city's segregated public schools?
Yeah, our biggest problem is that oftentimes the students that are most vulnerable end up in the same school, whether it's Title I or students with special needs. In my previous roles, I've looked at middle school screens, for example, and removing them or not reinstituting them after COVID
because we can't maintain a lottery across the district. That allows schools to be accessible by all students. Where we also look at structural things such as mergers of schools with different socioeconomic as well as just facilities makeup to see if we could trigger a lot of integration conversations, and we have been successful in doing that in a number of districts. And the question is, how do we look at that at scale, and especially when we talk about our schools that are most vulnerable. We talk about under-enrolled schools with 100, 150 students, even 200 students that are high Title I and therefore don't have the resources they need to actually be successful.
When you mentioned your previous role, you're talking about being the superintendent, right, for a couple of years.
Yeah, that was superintendent 2 districts, District 13 in Brooklyn and District 3 on our board side, Manhattan, a little bit of Harlem.
Now, your predecessors got embroiled in controversy, whether it's trying to change gifted and talented programs or trying to eliminate the test that allows kids to go to one of New York City's specialized high schools. How can you make change and not get bogged down?
It's a great question. The first thing you need to do is to really engage parents. In all of the things that I've done, I've started off with a conversation with parents who've listed our problems. When we do things together, it's not that folks won't disagree, it's that we will be able to have a framework around which to hear the disagreement and around which to really keep people in the conversation. So we're moving towards a solution. When you come to the table with something that's preconceived and already built out, oftentimes families really push back against that.
Enrollment at New York City's public schools is declining. And we should note that this isn't specific to New York City's national trend, right? It's driven by things like declining birth rates, affordability challenges, increased school choice. How do we bring kids back to school?
When I talk to parents, they want to make sure that there's a high-quality public school in their neighborhood. And when they don't see that, and when they have their second child and they're looking around and they don't want to spend the money it takes to go to private school, then they're looking outside of the city. When we commit ourselves, as we are, to creating a high-quality public school in each neighborhood, I think number one, that is going to really ensure that our families believe that they see a place for themselves in our city and in our schools. I also think that the idea that schools are safe, rigorous, and truly integrated is something that I believe families really want and are willing to buy into. And so when we work on making schools more integrated, making schools more welcoming for all, making schools safer for all, and ensuring that each child is being pushed to attain their full potential, I think that's when you're going to see folks really coming back to our schools.
When we talk about bringing diverse communities together, I mean, this is a fraught topic, right? And I mean, to get into it, it's racial, it's economic. Like you'll have a school in a wealthy neighborhood will say, well, wait a second, I don't want my school to close and send me to school in some other neighborhood that might not be as wealthy as mine. I mean, how do you do that? How do you convince those parents that that's something that they need to do?
All things that I've heard. So completely understand the question. It doesn't have to be fraught. Number one, there are strategies for conducting these conversations. Well, people have to be trained in doing this. You can't just get up and decide you want to have a big conversation about things that are so complicated involving race and socioeconomics. I'm trained as a facilitator of courageous conversations, and my task over the next certainly couple of months is to really introduce at a broader scale the resources for doing these conversations so folks are primed as we head into next year and beyond to be able to really take these conversations to communities.
The city hasn't yet announced a formal policy on AI for teachers and students. When do we expect one? And what are you thinking about as you come up with a plan?
Yeah, I don't see AI as a replacement for teachers at all. And so we need to first of all ask ourselves in what ways is AI effective at making sure that I'm better at my job, and then making sure the adults understand it, and then also as we're doing that, develop the safeguards for when we are engaging with students with AI. And so we will be releasing an AI playbook pretty soon in the next couple of months. And it has the potential to accelerate student learning.
Mayor Mamdani is moving ahead with plans to expand childcare to 2-year-olds. What part of that effort falls within the Department of Education and what part is outside of it?
This is a multi-agency collaboration. First of all, this is a huge step forward with our conversation with the state. This is really going to be something that all families need. I have so many friends. I have a 2-year-old myself, and the cost of childcare is very, very expensive. In terms of thinking about the payment structure for our service providers, and a lot of that is housed within the DOE pay scales, and how our providers are impacted by this. I think a lot of it comes from DOE.
Mayor shadowed a current policy to help homeless individuals called How does that policy work, and what are the plans for expanding it?
Over the last number of years, we've seen a dramatic increase in students in temporary housing. And so it's important that we have systems in place to make sure that every family is known, how we're working with our shelter system, how we're working through all of the apparatus within DOE and others, making sure that they are all talking to each other. And then also on the ground with our community schools, with our folks in schools, we're thinking about the expansion of this work. We did start that with the New York City Cares work that we did. Whether you are a new company, a new arrival to the country and to the city, or you've been here for a number of years and you've now fallen on hard times, that those students are in school and that they're ready for learning. I think this is a huge program that we really need to continue to look at.
That's the new New York City Schools Chancellor, Kumar Samuel. Chancellor, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
It's WNYC. All things considered continues just ahead. Justice Department has all but acknowledged its public corruption investigation has been an opportunity for recently fired DOJ attorneys.
Public corruption and rooting it out of our government is really our passion.
More on former government lawyers who are now starting their own firms. That's coming up in a moment here on WNYC. Stay with us. News headlines are next. 36 degrees at just about 7:30.
And while working Americans catch up, we're going to put a temporary cap on credit card interest rates at 10%. We have no choice.
That's what President Trump says he wants to do. A 10% cap would bring relief to millions of Americans, but can a president command how credit companies do business? And would they comply? That's on the next On Point. Weeknights at 8 on WNYC. WNYC receives support from Wisdom Keepers, a new PBS series that explores the timeless question of who we are and where we're going, where viewers can search for answers to life's biggest questions, now streaming on Apple TV.
WNYC, independent journalism in the public interest. 93.9 FM and AM 820. NPR News and the New York Conversation. Live from NPR News in Culver City, California, I'm Dwayne Brown. President Trump seems to be backing down on his threat of new tariffs on several European allies. After meeting with NATO's Secretary General in Davos today, Trump says he won't use force to acquire Greenland and has a, quote, framework of a future deal. This after staunchly criticizing our NATO allies. NPR's Mara Eliason has more.
It was a super threatening speech with a little nugget embedded in it, which was the pullback, at least for now, of the threat of using force. And I think that he did that to calm the stock markets, who are very agitated about this. He did say, I am seeking immediate negotiations to discuss the immediate acquiring of Greenland by the U.S. So does that mean he wants to negotiate something and he won't use force, or he's just backing off for now because it got such a bad reaction?
That's NPR's Mara Liasson. Investors greeting the latest comments with a sigh of relief after a roller coaster ride on Wall Street. Palestinian health officials, meanwhile, say 3 journalists were killed today in a targeted Israeli airstrike in the Gaza Strip. NPR's Anas Bala has more.
The 3 journalists were working with a drone camera, filming
acknowledge, but I think it's reality that they are all to
The unpredictability of the Trump administration is forcing the UK to face up to the uncomfortable truth that it may no longer be wise to rely on its long-standing allies, she says.